Good afternoon from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. My name is Stephen Clark from spaceflightnow.com, and welcome to our live coverage of the Starlink 4-15 mission awaiting liftoff today from Cape Canaveral at 4:40 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. That's 2040 UTC. You're looking live at Space Launch Complex 40, where SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket is vertical, 1 hour and 5 minutes away from liftoff. This mission will be carrying another batch of 53 Starlink Internet satellites into orbit. This mission follows a launch just 22 and a half hours before from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with another Falcon 9 mission. That launch yesterday from Vandenberg occurred at around 6:07 p.m. Eastern or 3:07 p.m. Pacific time, carrying the previous batch of 53 Starlink satellites to space, and 53 more are set to join them today from Cape Canaveral, heading into a similar inclined orbit at 53.2 degrees to the equator. SpaceX rolled out the Falcon 9 rocket and lifted it vertical overnight or early this morning in preparation for liftoff today. Launch is timed for precisely 4:40 and 50 seconds p.m. Eastern Time, or 2040 UTC. Veteran launch watchers will note the different appearance on today's mission on the Falcon 9 booster stage. It is a bright white. A brand new booster is out on pad 40 today awaiting liftoff, booster number 1073. This is just the second time this year that SpaceX has launched a brand new booster. And today's launch marks the 20th Falcon 9 flight of the year, so the second new booster in 20 flights so far in 2022, joining SpaceX's inventory of reusable rockets. Weather conditions are favorable for launch right now. The official weather forecast from the U.S. Space Force's 45th Weather Squadron indicated an 80% chance of favorable conditions for launch this afternoon. It is breezy, as it often is here in the afternoons in the late spring on Florida's Space Coast. But skies are sunny. There are a few scattered thunderstorms just inland, out over the Titusville area, just around 20 miles west of the launch pad. But those storms right now are hanging away from the launch site and away from the flight corridor of the Falcon 9 as it heads downrange. So right now, those storms are not expected to be a threat for an on-time launch today at 4:40 p.m. Eastern. This view of Space Launch Complex 40 again shows the 229-foot tall Falcon 9 rocket, or 70 meters tall, in its launch mount. The strongback erector arm on the right side of the vehicle is visible in this view. There are some heat waves in the area due to the hot conditions today. So if you see some shimmering in the view of the pad from our camera view a few miles away, that's due to the heat waves. On either side of the rocket are 2 lightning protection towers for a total of 4 towers. Those masts are in position, fixed in position at the launch pad to protect the rocket from lightning strikes while it's vertical, awaiting liftoff. Lightning is not a threat right now over Cape Canaveral. Again, as I mentioned, there are some storms off to the west, but they're not moving toward the launch site at this moment, so the countdown is continuing and weather conditions do appear to be favorable for launch this afternoon. T-minus 57 minutes and counting. You're continuing to look live at Space Launch Complex 40. Now 57 minutes away from liftoff of the Falcon 9. Throughout the afternoon, SpaceX's launch team has been preparing the Falcon 9 for the start of propellant loading. That propellant loading is scheduled to begin at T-minus 35 minutes, or at 4:05 p.m. Eastern Time, about 21.5 minutes from right now. The launch controllers are stationed in a launch control center near the south gate of Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, a few miles south of the launch pad. Right now you're looking at a live view of the pad from our position approximately 4 miles to the west of the pad, looking approximately due east toward pad 40. After liftoff, we'll be tracking the rocket. The skies are sunny, so we do expect some good visibility, at least through main engine cutoff, the cutoff of the first stage engines, which is expected about 2.5 minutes after liftoff. And then once the rocket is out of sight, we'll be switching over to SpaceX's live stream, showing onboard camera views of the Falcon 9's ascent on the second stage, as well as the descent of the first stage, heading toward the drone ship. Just read the instructions in the Atlantic Ocean. Now T-minus 48 minutes and 20 seconds. At this time, SpaceX's launch team is being electronically polled over the next few minutes for a go or no-go to begin propellant loading. That go or no-go should be confirmed a couple of minutes before the start of the scheduled start of propellant loading, which is T-minus 35 minutes. This booster stage, booster number 1073, was test fired at SpaceX's McGregor test facility a few months back, and then shipped here to Cape Canaveral for launch preparations. The booster was manufactured by SpaceX at its factory and headquarters in Hawthorne, California. There was no static fire test performed on this booster here at the launch site since its arrival. So the booster and its engines were fired in McGregor, Texas, and the next time they'll see action is in about 47 minutes, when the command to ignite the 9 Merlin engines is sent from the Falcon 9's flight computer at about T-minus 3 seconds. Again, those of you who have watched SpaceX missions before will often note the soot or charcoal colored markings on the boosters that have flown to space before. Some of the darker markings are from on boosters that have flown to space numerous times. The record for a Falcon 9 booster is 12 flights. 3 different Falcon 9 booster stages have achieved 12 flights. But today's mission is a brand new vehicle, brand new first stage, brand new second stage. The payload fairing, at least one half of the payload fairing does appear to have flown before, has some darker markings indicating that it has flown to space and has been subjected to the reentry heating before recovery. So at least one half, if not both halves, of the fairing at the top of the Falcon 9 has flown before. Now 46 minutes from launch. Those of you who want to set your watches or set the clock for the exact T0 time, the exact launch time today is 4:40 and 50 seconds p.m. Eastern Time, or 20:40 and 50 seconds UTC. Again, weather conditions here on Florida's Space Coast are favorable for launch this afternoon. Sunny skies overhead the launch pad and along the flight track, the immediate flight track northeast from Cape Canaveral. There are some thunderstorm cells off to the west of the launch site, but they're not encroaching within any limit for liftoff today. And the cells appear to be stationary on the radar, weather radar right now. So everything looking good for liftoff in 44 minutes time from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. This will be the Falcon 9 rocket's, the 20th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket this year, and the 16th Falcon 9 flight from Florida's Space Coast this year. There have been 4 Falcon 9 launches from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, including one just yesterday on a mission much like today's carrying 53 Starlink internet satellites into orbit, and 53 more Starlink broadband payloads are heading to space this afternoon from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station in Florida. Now about 8 minutes from the scheduled start of propellant loading, the Falcon 9 is fueled by kerosene, which RP1, which is a highly refined rocket-grade kerosene. RP1 will be loaded into both stages of the Falcon 9, beginning at T-minus 35 minutes. And liquid oxygen, which is a super cold densified oxidizer, will also be loaded into the Falcon 9 in the final 35 minutes of the countdown. All told, about 1 million pounds of propellant will be pumped into the launch vehicle. And at liftoff, the Falcon 9 will weigh about 1.2 million pounds fully loaded. And again, about 1 million of those pounds are from the propellants that will feed the Merlin engines on board the rocket during the climb to space today. Now T-minus 40 minutes, we do expect to hear word from SpaceX's launch control team in the next couple of minutes about the outcome of this electronic poll of all stations in the Launch Control Center on their readiness for propellant loading and launch this afternoon. The launch control team will be giving their status report, assessing various systems on the Falcon 9, the first stage, the second stage, and as well the Starlink satellites on board the rocket awaiting their ride to space today. Engineers will also be ensuring that the ground systems at Pad 40 are ready to go for the terminal countdown.
LD is go for propellant load and launch.
Now, just inside of T minus 38 minutes, we've heard confirmation from SpaceX's launch director that the team is go for propellant load and launch. So a good sign that the liftoff today remains scheduled for 4:40 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 2040 UTC. This mission is actually designated the Starlink 4-15 mission. It's the 46th SpaceX Falcon 9 launch that's been primarily dedicated to hauling satellites into orbit for the Starlink network. SpaceX is building out the broadband satellite fleet, and with this mission, with the 53 satellites on this mission, SpaceX will have launched exactly 2,600 satellites since the first test units launched back in 2018. However, not all of those spacecraft are remaining in orbit. The
Falcon 9
latest
tanks are
tally
venting
from,
for the start of prop load.
and we've heard confirmation now that the propellant tanks on the Falcon 9 are venting for the start of propellant load. About 2,200, a little over 2,200 satellites are currently in the Starlink network in orbit and operational, either providing service or climbing to their operational altitude.
This is the LD briefing the abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the primary countdown net. Launch control will abort the auto sequence immediately and proceed into the launch abort auto sequence. At T minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Launch auto sequence has started.
T minus 35 minutes, we've heard confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the launch auto sequence has started, and this marks the start of propellant loading. So about 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene and liquid oxygen are now flowing into the rocket. The kerosene will be loaded into the rocket up until approximately the T minus 5 minute 30-second point. Liquid oxygen will be loaded until about T minus 2 minutes, and then the tanks will be secured. The fueling system will be turned off, and the tanks will be pressurized for flight in the final minute of the countdown, all leading up to liftoff at 4:40 p.m. Eastern Time, or 2040 UTC. Again, 53 Starlink Internet satellites are cocooned inside that nose cone of the Falcon 9, inside the fairing on top of the rocket, awaiting their flight into orbit this afternoon. Now inside of 33 minutes. In the next few minutes, we do expect to see some vapors of gaseous oxygen appear around the Falcon 9 as the liquid oxygen boils off from the Falcon 9 rocket as it's loaded into the vehicle. The liquid oxygen is actually chilled down to several hundred degrees below zero, and it gradually boils off in the warm ambient Florida atmosphere here at the launch site. Launch Complex 40 is located at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. There's a satellite view showing its approximate Pad 40 saw its origins back in the 1960s in the Air Force's Titan rocket program, and then SpaceX took over the lease from the Air Force back about 15 years ago, and the very first Falcon 9 mission took off from this launch pad on June the 4th of 2010. Today's mission will be the 154th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since that very first maiden flight. We're looking live again at Space Launch Complex 40. The Falcon 9 now being loaded with propellant. For missions with boosters that have flown before, it's very apparent and obvious to see the frost and ice build up on the outer skin of the Falcon 9 during the propellant loading process. That's going to be more difficult to see today, not only because of the heat waves, which are present here on Florida Space Coast, but also because it's a brand new first stage booster, bright white. The vehicle is painted brand new, fresh from the factory at SpaceX headquarters in Hawthorne, California. So the white frost that builds up on the rocket will not be easily visible today. Now inside of 30 minutes until liftoff. It's currently 4:11 p.m. here on the east coast of Florida. Launch is scheduled for exactly 4:40 p.m., 4:40 and 50 seconds p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So 29 minutes and 34 seconds away. T minus 24 minutes and counting. You're continuing to look live at Space Launch Complex 40. The propellant loading process is now well underway. It began 11 minutes ago to pump rocket-grade kerosene, also known as RP1, into both stages of the Falcon 9. Super cold liquid oxygen, which is an oxidizer, also consumed by the Merlin engines, is being loaded in parallel on board the first stage of the Falcon 9. The second stage of the rocket, near the upper half of the vehicle, will be loaded with liquid oxygen beginning at T-minus 16 minutes. T-minus 21 minutes and 35 seconds. Again, this mission is carrying 53 Starlink Internet satellites into orbit. This photo on the left shows a view of what the Starlink satellites look like inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9. They're flat-packed in launch configuration, held down by metallic retention rods. Those retention rods will actually be released at the proper altitude and inclination about 54.5 minutes after launch to allow the Starlink satellites to fly free of the rocket. This photo comes from a previous Falcon 9 mission. Now T-minus 21 minutes and counting. Each of the Starlink satellites weighs a little more than a quarter ton. They're built on an assembly line at SpaceX's Starlink facility up in Redmond, Washington, near Seattle. After deployment from the Falcon 9, they'll extend solar panels and activate the propulsion systems and climb from their initial orbit at about 190 miles up to an operational altitude at 335 miles. Now T-minus 20 minutes and 18 seconds.
Stage 2, RP1 load complete.
Vapors now visible venting from the strongback next to the Falcon 9 rocket. This indicates that the propellant loading process is proceeding right on schedule. This venting comes from a purge of the liquid oxygen flow lines that lead up to the second stage, as well as a chill down of those lines to thermally condition them for the flow of super cold oxidizer into stage 2. That begins at T-minus 16 minutes. We've also heard confirmation moments ago from SpaceX that the second stage kerosene tank has been fully loaded. This is the first of the 4 propellant tanks to be filled during today's countdown. In parallel with the kerosene and liquid oxygen loading, SpaceX is also flowing helium pressurant into high-pressure tanks on board the Falcon 9. This helium is used to maintain pressure inside the propellant tanks during the rest of the countdown, as well as the climb into space as propellants are consumed by the Falcon 9's Merlin engines. T-minus 18 minutes and 53 seconds. To resume our discussion of the Starlink network, again, today's mission will add 53 new satellites to the network. 53 satellites launched just yesterday on a previous Falcon 9 flight, so the pace of deployment continues very rapidly with a series of Falcon 9 missions. Today, again, is the 46th Falcon 9 flight primarily dedicated to the build-out of the network. This photo from SpaceX shows what a Starlink ground terminal looks like. Customers, once they sign up for the service, will receive an antenna that looks like this that they can point toward the sky to link up with the Starlink satellites as they beam broadband signals as they fly overhead at an altitude of roughly 330 to 340 miles. Now T-minus 18 minutes and counting. Earlier this week, SpaceX released an updated coverage map showing where the Starlink service is currently available. This map, the light blue shades in this map show where the Starlink service is available now. So much of North America, United States, Mexico, and Canada, as well as most of Europe, southern parts of Australia, as well as some sections of South America, primarily in Chile and looks like Brazil. The the slightly darker shade shows where the Starlink service will become available soon. So again, some of the eastern half of North America, as well as parts of Australia, Latin America, will be available soon. So this shows the current status of where consumers, if they want to sign up for Starlink service, can begin receiving internet signals immediately upon receipt of an antenna from SpaceX. The next major milestone in the countdown will be the start of liquid oxygen loading into the second stage. We expect to hear confirmation of that in less than a minute's time.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
T-minus 15 minutes, so 15 minutes away from launch of SpaceX's Starlink 4-15 mission. If you've been following the countdown, you'll know that propellant loading began at T-minus 35 minutes. That was the start of the loading of RP-1 kerosene and liquid oxygen, also known as LOX, into the Falcon 9. The second stage was began to be loaded by LOX, liquid oxygen, about a minute and a half ago at T-minus 16 minutes. Looking ahead to what's left to go up until liftoff time, at T-minus 7 minutes, the engine chill down on the first stage's Merlin engines will begin. This is a process that thermally conditions the Merlin engines on the first stage for the flow of supercold oxidizer, which is stored at several hundred degrees below zero. Also, at about T-minus 5.5 minutes, the kerosene load into the first stage of the Falcon 9 will be secured. At that point, the kerosene will be fully loaded into both stages of the Falcon 9. At about the same time in the countdown, the Falcon 9's flight safety system, as well as the guidance system on board the vehicle will be confirmed ready for liftoff today. About 2 minutes before liftoff, the liquid oxygen loading will be secured, and at that point, SpaceX will have a 1.2 million pound rocket on pad 40, fully loaded, fully fueled for liftoff. And at T-minus 1 minute, the Falcon 9 will be transitioned to what's known as startup. The onboard computer will take command of the final minute of the countdown. The propellant tanks will be pressurized for flight, and SpaceX's launch director will give his go for launch inside that last minute, and the engine startup sequence will begin at T-minus 3 seconds, culminating with liftoff at T0. This mission marks the 154th flight of a Falcon 9 rocket since 2010, the very first Falcon 9 launch from the same pad 40, back in June of 2010. As we've mentioned several times, this is the first flight of this particular booster 1073, in SpaceX's fleet. It's also the 86th Falcon 9 launch since that very first one to originate from pad 40, and it's the 141st launch from this launch complex, including its previous use as a Titan launch pad. Now T-minus 12 minutes and 28 seconds. This is the 46th dedicated flight by SpaceX to carry Starlink satellites into orbit, and it's the 20th Falcon 9 launch of the year. So 20 launches in a little less than 20 weeks to start 2022, and it's the 19th orbital class launch from Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center so far this year. That figure includes 16 Falcon 9 flights, including today's, as well as 2 ULA missions, Atlas V rockets, as well as 1 launch attempt from Astra. Now inside 12 minutes until liftoff of the Starlink 4-15 mission. Now T-minus 11 minutes and 1 second, and T-minus 11 minutes mark. 11 minutes to go until launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from pad 40. This mission will be heading to the northeast, following a familiar path for Starlink missions. This map, the red line in this map, shows the approximate flight path of the Falcon 9 as it heads northeast. It'll be flying roughly parallel to the east coast of the United States, and then off the coast of the Canadian Maritime provinces. The map is also labeled with the locations of the launch pad, Slick 40, here at Cape Canaveral, Florida, as well as the location of the drone ship. This football field-sized vessel is located about 400 miles or 650 kilometers downrange from our location here at Cape Canaveral, roughly due east of Charleston, South Carolina, and landing of the first stage booster is expected about 8.5 minutes after launch. This timeline shows the various milestones on today's flight. The Falcon 9's Merlin 1D engines on the first stage will fire about 2.5 minutes, and then the stages will separate. That first stage will begin its descent back toward the drone ship. It'll deploy titanium grid fins, fire cold gas nitrogen thrusters to reorient itself to tail first orientation for re-entry into the atmosphere. Meanwhile, the upper stage will continue on into orbit. It'll deploy its nose shroud or payload fairing about T+2 minutes and 50 seconds. And the first stage will, at the same time, be descending back into the atmosphere. It'll be conducting a braking burn or entry burn, and then a final landing burn using its center engine, culminating in landing on the drone ship at T+8 minutes and 24 seconds. Meanwhile, the second stage's Merlin vacuum engine will cut off at T+8 minutes 50 seconds. It'll coast halfway around the world, and then over the Indian Ocean, about 45 minutes after launch, it'll reignite its engine for just a very brief 2-second burn. That's enough with that powerful Merlin vacuum engine to circularize its orbit, setting the stage for deployment of the Starlink satellites at T plus 54 minutes and 32 seconds. This is the target orbit aimed for on today's mission. An apogee or high point of 197 miles, a perigee or low point of 189 miles, and an inclination of 53.2 degrees to the equator. And once those Starlink satellites are cast free from the Falcon 9's upper stage, they will use ion propulsion to do the rest of the orbit raising to reach their operational altitude over the coming weeks and months at 335 miles. T plus 8 minutes and 20 seconds. Just to go back a little bit on the trajectory of the first stage booster, this graphic provided by SpaceX shows the various maneuvers in the initial phase of today's flight, showing the upper stage firing into orbit with these 53 Starlink satellites, and then the maneuvers that the first stage, which itself is about 15 stories in height, will undertake to re-enter the atmosphere and target a vertical landing on 4 carbon fiber landing legs on the drone ship. T minus 7 minutes and 45 seconds.
Engine chill has started. Stage 1 RP1 load is complete.
You're hearing occasional call-outs from SpaceX's launch team. We've heard the start of engine chill down. This is the process to thermally condition the first stage's Merlin 1D engines. And we've heard that the first stage's kerosene tank has been fully loaded. So kerosene is now fully loaded on board both stages of the Falcon 9. Liquid oxygen, which is the oxidizer consumed by the Merlin engines, will continue to flow into the vehicle for another 3 minutes or so.
Falcon 9 tanks are pressurizing for strong back retract.
Starting strong back retract.
T minus 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The strongback erector structure next to the rocket on the right side of the Falcon 9 in this view is beginning its motion to retract away from the vehicle. It'll be moving to a position just about 1.5 to 1.7 degrees from the Falcon 9. This is an intermediate retraction. At liftoff, the strongback will be retracted in a more rapid fashion to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb away from the pad. T-minus 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Everything looking good for launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket and the Starlink 4-15 mission at 4:40 p.m. Eastern Time, about 3.5 minutes away. This view, pad 40, you can now see the strong back in its retracted position at an angle of about 1.5 degrees from the launch vehicle.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
T-minus 2 minutes and counting. The Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant. We've heard confirmation from SpaceX's team moments ago that the liquid oxygen has been fully loaded into the vehicle, so kerosene and liquid oxygen tanks are now full on board the Falcon 9.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
T-minus 90 seconds. At the T-minus 60-minute point, the Falcon 9 will be transitioned to what's known as startup. This is when the onboard computer takes command of the countdown. And in the final minute or so, the launch team will make sure all systems are ready. The propellant tanks will also be brought to flight pressure. The vent valves will be closed, and the Falcon 9 will be put into its flight configuration. T-minus 60 seconds.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Starlink 415, LD, go for launch.
T-minus 30 seconds. The engine startup sequence will begin at T-minus 3 seconds. SpaceX uses a hypergolic igniter fluid known as triethyl aluminum and triethyl borane to ignite the Merlin engines at the bottom of the Falcon 9. So you'll see that flash of engine ignition at T-minus 3 seconds.
T-minus 15 seconds.
Standing by for engine ignition.
10, 9,
engine ignition.
8, 7,
and liftoff
6,
of SpaceX's
5,
Falcon 9 rocket,
4,
carrying 53
3,
more Starlink Internet
2,
satellites into
1,
orbit and debuting
0.
a new member
Ignition.
of SpaceX's Falcon
And
9
liftoff.
rocket
Go
fleet.
Falcon, go Starlink.
Falcon is pitching downrange.
M1D chamber pressures are nominal.
Falcon 9 heading downrange northeast, aligning itself with the orbital plane of SpaceX's Starlink Internet network.
Power and telemetry nominal.
A beautiful start to the Starlink 4-15 mission.
Falcon is supersonic. Maximum aerodynamic pressure.
We've heard confirmation that the Falcon 9 has passed the period of maximum aerodynamic pressure. Falcon 9 also now supersonic. Those 9 Merlin engines continuing to propel the Falcon 9 into the stratosphere now. About 45 seconds
Start
left
of
in the
MVAC
first stage
engine
burn.
chill.
Everything looking good so far. At T plus 2 minutes and 30 seconds or so, the Falcon 9's Merlin engines will be shut off and the stages will separate. That'll free up the first stage to begin its
Falcon
descent back
trajectory
toward the
nominal.
drone ship. Stage 2 will be heading for orbit with 53 Starlink satellites. Standing by for main engine cutoff. And there's main engine cutoff, visual confirmation of main engine cutoff.
Main engine cutoff. Stage separation confirmed.
And the second stage has ignited. We see that in the sky now.
MVAC ignition.
The plume from the MVAC engine on stage 2 behind some cloud cover.
Separation confirmed.
And we've heard confirmation of payload fairing separation. Those Starlink satellites now exposed to the environment of space for the first time. With the rocket now out of visual range, we're switching over to SpaceX's live feed from 2 onboard cameras. On the left side, you see a camera on the first stage that'll be following its descent back into the atmosphere. And on the right, you just saw the payload fairing separate from the upper stage. Now you're seeing a view of the glowing red-hot engine bell of the Merlin vacuum engine on the upper stage. This feed is coming to you with some latency. The SpaceX video stream does have some delay to it. So if you saw the clock jump backwards in time, that's because we switched to the SpaceX stream.
Acquisition of signal, Bermuda.
Both stages are on nominal trajectories.
Now T plus 5 minutes and 20 seconds. You're continuing to watch a live view from SpaceX's rocket cams on the left, a down-facing view on stage 1. On the right side, a view of the Merlin vacuum engine conducting its orbit insertion burn. Everything looking good. The upper stage at an altitude of 153 kilometers now. Stage 1 now 102 kilometers and descending.
Stage 1 FTS has saved.
Coming up
Stage
on
one,
the first
start up.
stage entry burn. That entry burn now underway.
Stage 1 entry burn shutdown.
You're seeing the plume from 3 Merlin engines now. This is a braking burn to set up the first stage for atmospheric reentry. You see the velocity meter on the lower left decreasing rapidly. Now T+7 minutes, and there's entry burn shutdown. It did leave some exhaust there briefly on the camera lens, however that's now cleared. You're looking at a live view on the left side as booster number 1073 comes into the drone ship area in the Atlantic Ocean northeast of Cape Canaveral, heading for its very first landing.
Stage 1 is transonic.
The first stage now transonic, passing below the speed of sound, heading for the drone ship. Just read the instructions. As we await news on the first stage, you're looking live at a view of stage 2.
Stage 1 landing burn.
Landing burn now underway, SpaceX reports on the first stage. And there's the view of the first stage coming in for landing.
Stage 2, terminal guidance.
Stage 1 landing lights deployed.
This video coming with a little bit of latency from SpaceX, but you see that landing burn underway. The first stage firing its center engine. There's landing leg deploy.
FTS is saved.
And landing confirmed. SpaceX's Falcon 9 booster now on the deck of Just Read the Instructions. Booster number 1073 has made its landing, completing its first flight and becoming a new member of SpaceX's reusable rocket fleet.
Second engine
Beautiful
cutoff.
view of the first stage on the deck of the drone ship. That drone ship about the size of a football field.
Expected loss of signal tape.
Standing by for cutoff of the upper stage engine now.
Nominal parking orbit.
And we've heard confirmation from SpaceX's launch team that the burn is complete and the upper stage has reached a nominal parking orbit. So a great start to the Starlink 4-15 mission, SpaceX's 20th flight of the year. One more burn is required, however, to complete the task of placing the 53 Starlink satellites into the proper orbit for deployment. And that deployment is expected at T+54 minutes, or at 5:35 p.m. rather, Eastern Daylight Time, or 21:35 UTC.
Acquisition of signal, Newfoundland.
Now about 11 minutes since the Falcon 9 departed Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, SpaceX has ended its live video stream of today's mission. However, the company continues to provide a live stream of audio from the Falcon 9 control team. They'll be calling out the major milestones over the next 45 minutes or so. The acquisitions of signal through various ground stations, as well as the restart of Stage 2's engine, as well as deployment of the 53 Starlink satellites. And we'll stay live with the audio, mission audio from SpaceX, as well as this tracking map from SpaceX, which shows the location of the second stage throughout its rest of its mission. The second stage now over the North Atlantic Ocean, just off the coast of the Canadian Maritime Provinces. It'll be heading over the North Atlantic toward the UK, and then over Northern Europe, and ultimately over the Middle East and over the Indian Ocean. And at that point, the second stage will relight its engine for just about 2 seconds. That engine produces more than 200,000 pounds of thrust, and so all it takes is a couple of seconds to nudge the rocket into a more circular orbit, and then Starlink deployment is scheduled at T plus 54 minutes and 30 seconds near Australia. T plus 15 minutes, all's well with the upper stage as it coasts in orbit, setting up for its next burn in about 30 minutes time. The Falcon 9 performed well in the first phase of its flight today. The booster climbed into the upper atmosphere and shut down its engines about 2.5 minutes after launch, and then detached from stage 2, and the booster began its descent back toward the drone ship. Just read the instructions, and nailed its landing on that vessel about 8.5 minutes after liftoff, after climbing just above the boundary of space on a 8.5 minute flight from pad 40 to the drone ship, covering about 400 miles in that 8.5 minutes. The second stage now in orbit after completing its 6-minute orbit insertion burn, now passing south of Greenland, heading for Europe, and then ultimately the Indian Ocean for its brief restart. This was the 46th dedicated Falcon 9 launch to carry Starlink Internet satellites into orbit. There was a launch just yesterday, the 45th, from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. SpaceX teams a few miles to the north of pad 40 at Pad 39A are gearing up for the 47th dedicated Starlink launch. That mission is scheduled for liftoff on May the 18th, Wednesday morning around 5 a.m. Eastern Time or 0900 UTC. You're looking now live at Pad 39A here at the Kennedy Space Center, where the strongback was just lifted vertical
Expected losses.
a short time ago. It was horizontal earlier this afternoon. So preparations there are underway. That strongback and transporter will be rolled back into the Falcon 9 hangar at the southern edge of Pad 39A in the coming days, where technicians will hoist the Falcon 9 and the Starlink Internet satellites inside the Payload Fairing onto that strongback structure, and then the entire structure will be returned to the pad. It'll be rolled up the ramp to Pad 39A in preparation for launch next week on the Starlink 4-18 mission. Today's mission number is Starlink 4-15. So busy times continue here at Cape Canaveral and at the Kennedy Space Center for SpaceX's team. SpaceX operates 2 launch facilities here on the Space Coast, separated by a few miles. You saw Pad 40 in action this afternoon. Pad 39A will see action next week. Also next week is the scheduled launch of a United Launch Alliance Atlas V rocket from Pad 41. That'll be carrying Boeing's Starliner crew capsule into orbit. On a test flight, this will be the second unpiloted or uncrewed test flight of the Starliner spacecraft, which is designed to ultimately carry astronauts up to the International Space Station. That launch is scheduled for Thursday, May the 19th. Liftoff is timed for 6:54 p.m. Eastern Time or 22:54 UTC on a test flight to the International Space Station.
Expected loss of signal, Goonhilly.
T plus 31 minutes and 48 seconds in this tracking map from SpaceX. The second stage, as you can see, is now passing over the Middle East. It's just passed over parts of Turkey and then down southeast across Iraq. Now passing over eastern Saudi Arabia next, and then ultimately out over the Arabian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. So in 32 minutes, the Falcon 9 and the 53 Starlink satellites have traveled from Cape Canaveral to a position nearly 200 miles over the Middle East, about 13 minutes away from the restart of the Merlin vacuum engine on the second stage. That MVac engine will restart at T plus 45 minutes and 30 seconds approximately for a very brief, roughly 2-second burn to maneuver the rocket and the payloads into the proper orbit for separation.
Acquisition of signal, Maldives. Acquisition of signal, Diego Garcia.
Now, more than 40 minutes since the Falcon 9 rocket took off from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, with the next 53 Starlink Internet satellites on board. This tracking map shows that the second stage is now flying on a southeasterly course over the Indian Ocean, about 5 minutes away from restart of the MVAC upper stage engine to set up for deployment of the Starlink satellites at T+54 minutes. This mission is carrying 53 satellites, as I mentioned. This image on the left side of your screen here shows what the 53 Starlink satellites look like in launch configuration, as they're flat packed, packed together in a flat packed fashion inside the payload fairing of a Falcon 9 rocket. This photo is from a previous mission, but the satellites launched today look much the same. That payload shroud jettisoned from the Falcon 9 about 3 minutes after liftoff, once the second stage had reached the rarefied ultra-thin layers of the upper atmosphere. And now the second stage, with those 53 satellites on board, is gearing up for a restart and then separation of the 53 satellites. The satellites, as they're held down for launch, are held down by 4 metallic retention rods. If you look closely in this view, you can see one of the retention rods in the middle of the screen, in the middle of that packed configuration of Starlink satellites, that vertical rod. 4 of those are on board the vehicle. Those will be released, and once those are released, the Starlink satellites are free to begin flying away from the rocket. They'll fly away almost unfolding like a deck of cards on a table, and they will naturally begin to separate, and then over time they will deploy solar panels and switch on their ion thrusters to begin phasing themselves into the Starlink constellation and raising their orbit from the drop-off point to 335 miles. These satellites are built on an assembly line in Redmond, Washington, at SpaceX's Starlink development facility near Seattle. Each one of them weighs a little more than a quarter ton, nearly 300 kilograms or so. And they're heading for an operational orbit at 335 miles, or 540 kilometers. And that orbit raising will take a number of weeks to months before the Starlink satellites are actually in the proper position at the proper altitude to begin commercial service. The target orbit for today's mission that the second stage guidance computer is aiming for with this upcoming burn is an apogee or high point of 197 miles, a perigee or low point of 189 miles. That's roughly 305 by 318 kilometers at an inclination of 53.2 degrees to the equator. And the inclination basically is a measure of the latitude extremes north and south of the equator that the Starlink satellites reach during each lap around the planet Earth. This next view shows a image of a Starlink ground antenna. This is the antenna that Starlink consumers would receive if they sign up for SpaceX's internet service. The low latency internet service is designed to reach consumers anywhere in the world eventually that where internet service is poor or non-existent. This next view shows a coverage map that SpaceX released earlier this week showing where the Starlink service is currently available. The currently available regions are shaded in light blue. You can see much of North America, especially the western half of North America, Canada, Mexico, and the United States, currently has Starlink service available, as well as most of Europe, as well as parts of Latin America and Australia. The next shade up, the mid-grade shade of blue, is where the Starlink service should be available soon in some regions later this year or in early 2023. Now about a minute away from the restart of the second stage's Merlin vacuum or MVAC engine. This engine will puts out about 200,000 pounds of thrust at full power. And with that powerful upper stage engine, that's a rather powerful engine for an upper stage on a rocket, the engine only needs to burn for about 1 to 2 seconds to do the maneuver necessary to place the Starlink satellites into that target orbit that I mentioned, 189 by 197 miles at an inclination of 53.2 degrees to the equator. The first burn of the upper stage, which ended just prior to the T+9 minute point about 35 minutes ago, placed the rocket and the satellites into a preliminary parking orbit or transfer orbit. And once the rocket reaches the proper position above the Earth at the proper altitude, that engine will relight. And we should hear confirmation of that momentarily.
MVAC ignition and MVAC shutdown.
Nominal deploy orbit.
And there you have it from SpaceX Launch Control, MVAC ignition and MVAC shutdown right on time. That burn lasted just about 1 to 2 seconds, and then the call out a few moments after that was a nominal deployment orbit, indicating that the rocket is now at the proper orbital, is in the proper orbital parameters for separation of the 53 Starlink satellites. And that deployment is expected in about 8 minutes, and that'll be the next one of the next call-outs you hear from Launch Control will be Starlink separation confirmed. That coming in about 8 minutes or so when the rocket is off the coast of Australia.
Expected loss of signal, Maldives.
expected loss of signal, Diego Garcia.
Now T plus 52 minutes and 30 seconds, about 2 minutes away from the scheduled separation of the 53 Starlink internet satellites. In this map view from SpaceX, you can see stage 2 and the 53 payloads are approaching the southwestern coast of Australia. The Falcon 9 upper stage will be spun up to reach the proper spin rate for the deployment of the 53 Starlink satellites. This helps the 53 spacecraft spread out from angular momentum once they are cast free from the upper stage. Now T plus 54 minutes. We'll be standing by for audio confirmation from SpaceX Launch Control that the Starlink deployment has been completed. Again, the deployment works by releasing 4 metallic retention rods that held the Starlink satellites down to the rocket during the climb to space this afternoon. And once those rods are gone, the Starlink satellites are then free to naturally fly away from the upper stage in orbit.
Starlink separation confirmed.
Acquisition of signal, Tasmania.
And now you've heard confirmation, if you're listening to our live stream from SpaceX Launch Control, that the 53 Starlink satellites have deployed from the Falcon 9 upper stage. That deployment occurred about 5 minutes ago, but the confirmation was delayed a few minutes to wait for the Falcon 9 to pass in range of a ground station in Tasmania. And once that signal was acquired, data from the rocket confirmed that the deployment event did occur. Again, the deployment of the Starlink satellites works by releasing metallic retention rods that allows the Starlink satellites, each of them about 300 kilograms, a little less than 300 kilograms, to fly free of the rocket in orbit. No springs, no pyrotechnic involved with the deployment of the Starlink satellites. So with those satellites now free of the rocket, they'll begin their post-launch activations. The satellites will each deploy a solar panel to begin charging their batteries, and then they'll So with those 53 Starlink satellites now in orbit, you're looking again at a live view of Launch Complex 40, the strong back in its retract position where it retracted at liftoff to clear the way for the Falcon 9 to begin its vertical climb away from Pad 40. So a successful launch in the books, Starlink 4-15. Mission success confirmed from SpaceX with those 53 Starlink satellites in the proper orbit after a liftoff from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station at 4:40 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, or 2040 UTC. Looking ahead, what we'll be covering next. Stand by while we get the proper graphic ready for our launch schedule to look ahead at what we'll be covering next. So just bear with us a moment. So today's launch originated from Launch Complex 40. The next launch we'll be covering here on Florida Space Coast will be from Pad 39A, which you're looking at now live. This live view of Launch Complex 39A shows the Strongback Transporter Erector Arm vertical. This is in preparation to pick up the so-called reaction frame at the pad and return that to the launch pad hangar just on the southern edge of Pad 39A. That entire structure will be rolled back into the hangar in the coming days to pick up another Falcon 9 rocket, and that integration will occur inside the hangar, and the rocket will be returned and rolled back out to Pad 39A and rolled up the ramp and erected vertically. That mission is scheduled for launch on Wednesday morning, currently scheduled for approximately 5 a.m. Eastern Time or 0900 UTC. We're waiting and expect to get a more precise launch time in the next couple of days. That mission, much like today's flight, will be heading into orbit with 53 Starlink satellites. So that'll be the third Starlink mission that SpaceX will have launched in less than 5 days from SpaceX's 3 operating launch pads, 1 in California, 2 here in Florida. And as you can see now, we have this graphic ready looking ahead. That Starlink 4-18 mission I was just discussing is set for Wednesday, May the 18th from Launch Complex 39A. The next day, about 36 hours later, a little over 36 hours later, United Launch Alliance will be launching its third mission of 2022. That will be an Atlas V rocket launching Boeing's Starliner crew capsule. This Starliner spacecraft is designed to be a human-rated vehicle to carry astronauts to and from the International Space Station. That launch is scheduled to depart from Pad 41 at Cape Canaveral at 6:54 p.m. Eastern Time or 22:54 UTC. This mission is a redo of a Starliner test flight from back in 2019 that was cut short by software problems that prevented the spacecraft from reaching the space station and accomplishing all of its demonstration objectives. So this is an unpiloted test flight. If all goes well, that will help clear the way for the next Starliner mission, perhaps at the end of this year or sometime in early 2023 at the earliest, to carry astronauts to the space station. And that'll be the first time that the United States will have 2 independent vehicles capable of carrying astronauts into orbit, operating simultaneously, the other being SpaceX's Dragon capsule. Looking ahead after May the 19th, the next launch from here in Florida will be May the 24th. It'll be SpaceX's 5th transporter small satellite rideshare mission, and the action will return to Pad 40, which you saw today, for a launch of dozens of small satellites for a variety of customers. That mission will be heading south from Cape Canaveral into a polar orbit, and the booster stage is expected to return to Landing Zone 1 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station for a return to launch site landing. And then that's expected to be the last launch of the month from here in Florida, but the next mission we'll be monitoring for live coverage will be on May the 31st, when Rocket Lab is scheduled to launch NASA's Capstone mission. This is a CubeSat, roughly the size of a briefcase, that'll be heading to the moon, and it'll be orbiting the moon, and it'll be Rocket Lab's first mission to fly a payload beyond Earth orbit. And this mission will demonstrate navigation and communication technologies at the moon as a pathfinder for NASA's Artemis program. And that launch will be originating from Rocket Lab's facility down in New Zealand. So that's what's on the calendar over the next couple of weeks. There'll be other launches likely occurring during that time that we don't have confirmed schedules for at this time. We'll leave you again with a live shot of Pad 40. The rocket departed on time at 4:40 p.m. Eastern Time. 53 Starlink satellites successfully deployed in orbit. We thank you for joining us for our live coverage this afternoon. We'll see you again next week for a few different live events, including a Falcon 9 launch, an Atlas V launch, as well as the rollout of the Atlas V and Starliner spacecraft next week in preparation for that OFT-2 mission. So until then, I'm Stephen Clark reporting live from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Thank you for joining us.